Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my talk. Yeah, I'm Harry. I actually did my undergrad and PhD studies here at U, so it's really nice to be back here. But since then I've started working at K's. We do a lot of consulting around cybersecurity, but also developing some like cybersecurity solutions, particularly around vulnerabilities recently. And we also release a lot of open services and open resources, which this is kind of this talk kind of stems from. So let's look at how can we build, what's the approach to building a risk scoring system, and how can we make, empower people to do that and follow this kind of approach that we've used. So we start off with why prioritize? Why do we need to, if there's a vulnerability, why can't we just go and remediate them all, right? Let's get rid of all the vulnerabilities. Well, once upon a time, in the early 2000s, when there weren't so many vulnerabilities being published, you might have been laughing, right? You might have been lucky to get a vulnerability on your laptop and you just go and remediate it and your work's done, right? But this is actually a graph showing per year how many new vulnerabilities are being published. So these are all accumulating, right? Over 200,000 vulnerabilities are registered as an official vulnerability, and you can see they're getting progressively higher and higher, especially in the recent years. So, we're moving into, you can't just do things manually anymore. You can't just look at this little list and go and remediate them. There needs to be that, there's a data-driven world now. A lot of these fields become data-driven. There's so much data, you need technology and automated solutions, in this case prioritization, to help you go about remediating what you need to in your organization or personally, right? So a lot of these cybersecurity companies, they gather a lot of evidence from their clients and stuff, right? And so Mend.io, for example, they've got this number, 13%. So I think they done that kind of review of 1,000 companies, and on average, a company can only remediate 13% of the vulnerabilities they have, right? And I've looked at, there's a couple of other sources for that, and it's around 10%. There's a lot of vulnerabilities. You need to prioritize which ones are the riskiest, so you can do the 13 top percent, on average 13% of the top riskiest ones, right, that are going to actually, likely affect your organization. And what are your options? So there's loads of amazing, great proprietary paid-for solutions. Obviously you've got Mandiant, ZeroFox, all these big companies providing really robust, powerful, cybersecurity solutions, but in particular what we're looking at is vulnerability management and remediation tools. But as you can imagine, you got to pay for a lot of these. It can be quite expensive. If you're a plus billion revenue dollar company, you can afford that, and that's great. If you're a small to medium enterprise or a community driven project, that's an issue. And then what I would say is an even bigger issue is that a lot of these are pretty much black boxes. It's you got to trust them that they're going to do a good job. They're a big company that everyone says works well, and that's it, right? They don't. I've purposely put Orpheus. I know Orpheus do publish a white paper, and I've gone through their vulnerability scoring thing, but there's no explicit definition of how they're doing it in there. You won't be able to go and reproduce what they've done, right? So, but these companies, they're all depending on there's a lot of openly available standards and data out there now that they're drawing from, and anyone can draw from. It's openly available. It's all out there. So for these small to medium enterprises or community-driven projects who want to build these solutions, you can tap into that. And we want to, in this talk, I want to show you how you can bring that all together into one kind of concise calculation that's transparent, that you can explain to anyone and share. That's not, stuck behind a proprietary black box or anything, right? This is a really cool kind of graph of the growing, number of vulnerabilities, but also all these open standards that are being released with, new iterations and versions. I highly recommend you check out this guy on LinkedIn. He came up with this graph. He's got loads of cool vulnerability visualizations. But the key takeaway I think here is while the vulnerability is increasing, the open data available out there is maturing, becoming, there's more information, there's more data out there that you can utilize to really prioritize your risk score now. And I think I'll just point out a CVE is basically a standard they created as early as 1999, and that's basically an ID tag they assign to a vulnerability. So an ID tag so you can communicate, coordinate between people what a vulnerability is, right? And then you can assign all these kind of scores and data to it and information, references to where they're used, etc. So if we want to talk about defining a formula or risk calculation, let's go back to what is risk. So the NIST define it as essentially impact times likelihood. So if this vulnerability was to be exploited, what's your consequential impact going to be experienced? And then likelihood. So if you have a really severe vulnerability, it's never going to be exploited, so a low likelihood, then it's not going to be considered very risky, right? And then vice versa. So it's kind of this combination of these two components, like impact, how bad is it going to be, and then how likely is it actually going to even happen. So we want to bring those kind of concepts into our calculation. So one of the open standards for severity scoring is called the CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System. This essentially, like the vendors or like the expert, the vulnerability owner, when the CVE, this vulnerability gets like published, it's kind of mostly a subjective scoring system. So they come in and, for example, if we look at this base metric group, they come in and look at these impact metrics, like confidentiality impact, integrity impact, and they'll come in and kind of score it with like an ordinal system, like none, low, high, this kind of thing. And it's CVSS has been maturing a lot. It's gone through a lot of like teething problems. People had a lot of issues with how things were getting scored earlier on. But I think literally last week, version 4 came out, and it's got a lot more than it used to, in the sense that they're actually bringing in like threat metrics and stuff. So I would say going beyond purely a severity metric. But because of that modular way they not modular, but like the way they break down this scoring system, you can always get into that impact kind of category there. We'll see how well CVSS matures into like a real risk score, because it's one thing defining that standard, but it's always dependent on these kind of manual, subjective inputs a lot of the time. So, for example, they're not even adopting that into the databases until next year, apparently, I heard. So we'll see how that actually goes. So the principle still stands. We probably still want to make our own risk calculations for now until that actually is a great solution. But yeah, important bit is impact metrics are in there, and we just talked that impact's a really important part of risk calculation, right? Another really interesting one that I'm always super excited about is the EPSS, so Exploit Prediction Scoring System. So this one's about likelihood. So how likely is a vulnerability to be exploited? Really cool. So this studies, by the way, roughly only 5% of vulnerabilities are known to be exploited. So that's quite useful. Like a lot of the time you can disregard a lot of vulnerabilities if they're basically not going to be exploited. So really focus on trying to find that 5%, because remember, you can remediate 30% of vulnerabilities. So if you can overlap that across that 5% that are going to exploit it, that's great. So that's a really good score, and it's actually based on an AI model. So using gradient boosted tree model, they've gathered loads of training data. So I think they approached a few different companies like Alien Vault, and they have like honeypots on the internet, so they can see what vulnerabilities are exploited, and they provide that to the people who behind this research. So they have this labeled data set. They could see in like a 30-day window what vulnerabilities had been exploited, and then they feed into their machine learning model. I think there's like dozens and dozens of parameters. It's like, the CVSS scores fed into it, but also like, what vendor is affected, how many references are connected to that vulnerability, and loads of other things. So they feed all these different parameters into the machine learning model, train it on the known exploited vulnerabilities from these vendors. And it's become really, really powerful, especially, so this is a rock graph. I'm not going to explain exactly what that means, but top right is better. It means get more true positives, but less false positives. So you can see that, especially for EPSS version 3, which came out, I think this year, or early last year, really good improvement on that, basically accuracy, you can call it, like the accuracy of that model, capturing true positives and not bringing back a load of false negatives either. But EPSS is all about exploitability. It's that likelihood component, right? So let's revisit our abstract definition of risk. And we can start to think about, well, a risk score simply could just be these two, right? CVSS and e-score, but let's just say EPSS. But yeah, so we can do a calculation like this. Okay, but this is still abstract. Let's actually go to the real calculation in a moment. But I'll just say there's other sources of likelihood, right? We've got a machine learning model predicting, and yes, it's accurate, right? But why don't we go and look at what are the known exploits out there as well and bring that into our risk calculation? So I think last year, this repository of known exploited vulnerabilities came out, Kev. Metasploit, if some exploits in Metasploit, if you like go and basically scrape that out of their repository, you can be pretty sure that that's exploitable vulnerability. Google's Project 0 Day is full of 0 days. There's also Exploit DB, basically a database of people uploading like proof of concept code for exploiting vulnerabilities. So if you go and scrape all these sources, you can actually find a vulnerability has an exploit, a known exploit. You're not even using a machine learning model anymore. This is a pretty sure way of knowing something's being exploited in the wild. You also got GitHub. You can scrape GitHub for proof of concept code. So although that's not a guarantee that's being exploited, the potential is there that someone's put a proof of concept code out for that. Social media, really interesting one. So, X, Twitter, Reddit, they're pretty good sources of communities of people talking about vulnerabilities. They have APIs. You can gather, basically search on CVEs every day and bring out all the traffic from there. So obviously it's like an unofficial source. So, pick up, it can pick up nonsense. So you want to be able to process this and filter this. It's not just go and get CVs for me. You've got a bit of work to do there on the programming side, but really useful for picking up any early warning for 0 days. So there's this with the CVEs, in the Western world, they get published to the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database. But sometimes there's a latency before they pick up on that and go and publish it. So social media, really useful for picking up on that. And then you can kind of get an idea of how impactful or, if it's being exploited by considering what's the kind of making an estimate on what kind of audience size have you got there. So if if the NVD on Twitter talking about this CVE and they have 10 million followers, that's a lot of audience people are going to be seeing and be exposed to that CVE. You can rate that higher, right, in your risk calculation. So that's a lot of talk about data sources we can tap into. Let's look at building a risk formula. Okay, so I haven't defined any of these on here, but I'm working on a paper where there's a full definition for this. But let's just call this. It's a weighted calculation, right? We're going to take all these data points in, like CVSS, EPSS, number of exploits, social media audience. Let's bring them in. Let's give them a weight. So all the weights should add up to 1. So when you multiply each of these and add them together, you want to have that normalized range. You want your score to come out between 0 and 1. It doesn't have to be 0 to 1. I prefer that. It could be 0 to 10. You would just have your weights add up to 10, right? So let's look at this in a nice way on a presentation. Let's just imagine we find a CVE with these components, with this, CVSS score with this, EPS of this, one known exploit, and say 150,000, people exposed on social media to this CVE. Okay, so let's just pop them through a weighted calculation with these weights, and we've just got 15,002 0.221. Okay, it's useless because we're not getting the right normalized range for all our metrics, right? All our data sources. It's just heavily favored Twitter. Like nothing else matters. Okay, that didn't work. So what do we need to do? What's the solution to get around that problem? It's basically just mapping these ranges to a sensible 0 to 1 range to go through the calculation. So they are just functions, but there's like in animation and like game development, using function is essentially mapping from like usually the time domain to like a physical like placement or something. So when you throw a ball, it's like tracking that. So you pick one of these and you'd be able to mimic physics without doing a full physics simulation, this kind of thing. So I found this, on this website, they have a bunch of different easing functions, and you can kind of find something that's appropriate to map from one of your data sources to this. So let's just go for an example, easiest way. So an example I would use here, social media audience. So with social media audience, you don't want to have, if there's like 10, 20 people talking about a CV or being, exposed to a CV from like a tiny Twitter account, you don't want much impact. As you start to get maybe to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, you want that, because on the y-axis, actually this, show it on here because I actually mapped it out with numbers, that would help. So yeah, when you're in the thousands, not too much impact, but then when you come up to like the hundreds of thousands, you start getting some actual contribution to your risk formula coming out. So 100,000, there's only 0.175. And then on this curve I built, 225, it's actually like, 0.66. When you get to 1 million, then it's like, okay, you're up here, you get diminishing returns. Anything over 1 million is basically almost 1, right? So awesome. We got a way to map massive audience sizes, and there's no upper limit on it. Who knows how many people on Twitter could be exposed to CV. This handles it perfectly. Well, I won't say perfectly, but it's a good solution, I think, for that, for mapping across. And obviously you get kind of parameters to control the shape of your curve. So if you want more impact at a lower number of audience, you can control that, the shape of the curve. Just another example, known exploits. So I would go for this kind of exponential curve, kind of like this, defined like that. And that's, if you've got a known exploit, you probably want to just bump something up straight up to a really high risk value, right? So as soon as you have one, you're just increasing the risk contribution from known exploits into your formula a lot. And then, if you got like 2, you're basically on the full impact, and then again diminishing returns. But once you have known exploits, that's it in the bag, right? And again, you got parameter like to control the shape of your curve if you want different values to come out of that. Okay, sweet. So you can now pass through your values of different ranges, different metrics, or whatever you want to call them, and you can bring them through these easing functions. They're just functions, and get out a normalized range. So now everything, when you pop it through your weighted risk formula, you got a value between 0 and 1. So now everything, any CVE data you put through your calculation, you're going to get between 0 and 1. It's all normalized, it's all comparable, and you can build a prioritized list from that now. So, is it one score to rule them all? Have I just told you the ultimate score? I don't think so. I'm just telling you the approach. I'm just saying you can use these weighted formula. These are a bunch of data sources. You can use these easing functions, these functions to map to a normalized range in a shape or curve that makes sense. But obviously that's just an approach, right? But you can change this up. You can say, I don't find the CVSS very useful for impact. I don't trust subjective sources. There's loads of papers saying it's got a lot of flaws. I'll swap that out and I'll just use CTI cat. So the number of times the CV comes up in cyber threat intelligence reports. Let's say I think the social media is a bit vague. Let's use a natural language processing of the social media to get like some semantic value out of that, and they use a score like that instead of the audience. Okay, so you can just swap things out. You can come up with your own data sources for impact. Obviously, you want to get impact and likelihood in there, but from there, where you get the sources from, it's up to you and how you map those. Just make sure, you use the right mapping curve, and then you put through those, right, to come to that normalized range. And then we haven't even got started and won't really have time to go into local scoring context. I've just talked about CVs I'm generalizing this CV is 0.75 risk, but is that important to your organization? So what I'll say, when you have a vulnerability on your device, let's call it a vulnerability instance, VI, you have your CVE. In general, it's this risk score. But when it actually comes onto one of your devices, how impactful is it actually going to be for your organization, right? Your servers might have a really high technical impact you want to allocate to it, but your CEO's business laptop is going to have a very high business impact. And these are, the way I'm describing these are essentially their values you'd assign to each device, kind of manually. So you want to feed this general risk score for vulnerability into a calculation for your vulnerability instances. So yeah, I can imagine it like this. We just did that risk calculation up here for a global risk calculation. But let's build another tier for our local context for the vulnerability instance calculation. So we could just imagine putting that global risk calculation to another layer of a weighted formula, but then multiply or weight it and then add it along with the business impact and the technical impact of okay, so my laptop might just restart in a minute. And then you're going to get a prioritized list of and we can go about remediating the top ones on your prioritized list first, right? But it doesn't have to stop there. Why not optimize your prioritization? Vulnerability, risk, exposure is one thing, but what about your personnel hours to get to them, the cost? You could use a optimization algorithm, a goal programming. If you can actually get estimates or real hard values for any of these kind of metrics, you can build out real optimized prioritized lists to actually get a remediation plan that's the best bang for your buck, with the cost involved in the personnel hours or time to remediation. You get the most reduction in risk associated with those other goals that your company or your team might have. So quickly, some useful resources I'd like to just press on that come out from that you can use if you want to build your own risk formula. CV3. So K's, we have a Git repository. We routinely weekly publish all the latest vulnerability information we have to this repository with a schema that looks like this. And I would say this has all the vulnerability information I've just covered in the slides that you could build a risk formula yourself from. This is just on GitHub. You can go and get this data. It's not live and dynamic, but every week you'll be able to get a decently fresh risk calculation out of the data provided in here. The company also, K's also have some free services online. One's called CV Shield. So you come on here, and this is our ops dashboard for looking at trending, on social media, trending vulnerability with the tweets that you can go and look at, but also it shows you, the score we built with that risk formula approach called the V score, CVSS, all the kind of details provided on here. You can come on there for free. And then if you wanted to come and have a look at more detailed breakdown of all the vulnerabilities, it's again free, but you can sign up for an account and go and search. It's basically a database or search engine for vulnerabilities that you can go and explore. And yeah, it's the end of the talk, but I'm really interested to open it up to questions because, this is just this is the approach we're using. I'd be really interested to know what other people think. I'm just really excited to hear what other people think about this approach or if they've done anything similar or if there's any recommendations, this kind of thing. So yeah, if anyone, yeah.
Really good talk, loved it. How are you measuring the virality on social media? Is it just like the amount of followers an account has versus, because obviously it's quite a complicated thing to measure accurately, right?
Yeah.
Virality of a post. So I was just wondering what the methodology behind that part of it was.
Yeah, so that social media is kind of the max exposure. So if an account, so for vulnerability, if an account tweets it, we add all their followers, their follower count. That's on Twitter anyway. For Reddit, there's a different process. That's a little bit more complicated because they have like karma scores and a community has a number of followers. So you kind of will have a breakdown of the percentage using that. Yeah, for Twitter, it is just adding all of the people who've tweeted that vulnerability, adding their followers up. Obviously, without duplications. If the same account tweets twice, you don't add it twice. That's the approach we use for the social media audience, yeah. It's kind of like a max possible audience.
Okay, yeah.
Because obviously not every follower is going to see the CV.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. I'm glad you got onto the bit of context, because I've written down what about the business context.
Yeah.
So it's quite a difficult one to automate, but in my experience, it's lots of different factors. I know you showed on the slides a few points. Have you got anything else around? For me, the context ranges from whether it's a business critical function, whether it's not personal information, probably rates it up further, whether it's going to cause any reputation harm. There's all those sort of other things beyond the technology. So it's like I said, the time and the outage.
Yeah.
Have you got any other thoughts about what else?
Not loads of thoughts. I kind of leave it to that point where, like, you know, I've showed that approach and like you can reapply that to the local context with the weighted stuff, right? So I think with vulnerability scoring, it's obviously so important. About the context is so important, but it's so contextualized. It's like it's just different for every organization, I think, and that's why I think the approach to building that out. But I think it's so varied between what organization you go to, what's important. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just say I've got the same vulnerability in 2 or 3 places. One is not exposed to the internet. It's extreme. So it's not at business level. It's at the thing level. If it's a better word for that. So, you know, my team might not be worried about it, but another team in my organisation probably should be. So it's not one, I think they won't score for all. It's even within a business, it might not be the same score across the business.
Oh, I see what you mean, yeah.
In my head.
Like, I see what you mean. Like the people's, like, responsibilities within their company between each other is different as well.
Organisation that's got lots of bits to it. We're all using the same component. Across. Yeah, that's the bit I was trying to think is, even within a business, you probably need that. Well, it starts up here, it's adjusted down because it's not, we've got no personal information in that. So I'm saying it's fair game to people. I'm not going to put you up exact. Whereas the other one, I almost certainly would.
Yeah. Another one we usually rate for the contextual side is like criticality, system criticality. Might cover something like that. But going back to your point about like the position like on a network, say of a device, if it's not even on the internet, we actually do like in the company we've done some like experimentation with like network simulations, and that could be another component in the risk calculation, right? Or this risk calculation could feed into that. That's actually how we do it. So there's a really interesting project called Yawning Titan that uses like agent-based AI models to like attack a network, and it's an open source project. So we used it and then used like the risk calculations we come up with to say how like vulnerable these nodes. So if you wanted to build out your organization's network, you put all your nodes and say what the connections are between them, then like let loose this AI simulation to attack it, and based on all the risk scores associated with each device, like how like easily they could be compromised and exploited in that simulation, to get like an insight into that kind of network configuration side of things, like where and the position of your organization, how that affects the likelihood it will get exploited. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah.
At what stage in an organisation's cyber maturity would you suggest using this approach? So much to that, when an organisation first hears out cybersecurity, all of what is this, they're patching the immediate stuff. But at what point do you would you say now we need to start actually ranking the risk, or do you think that's the first thing organisations should do when they're introduced to cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think like in the past it would have been difficult to, but I think we're in like a space now where it's quite easy to prioritize it and start remediating with with a plan or an informed reason to go and remediate something over another. For small businesses, obviously, like they don't have a person who's even familiar with this space, so it is difficult to get into. But I think that's why I don't really want to press that this is a solution for small to medium-sized enterprises. This is like also useful for like a community-driven effort. Like this is like empower everyone to be able to build something, but not everyone's going to be able to. But if a community built out like a really robust scoring system that collated all this together, and then all these small to medium-sized enterprises could tap into that instead of paid solution that they wouldn't be able to justify previously because they don't have the revenue to. Then, so I don't think, I know like what you're saying. Like right now, what can we do? Maybe we're not there just yet that everyone can tap into that. But I think there's all the data's there. I think it's just like a real accessible, free solution that people can tap into is really important, and that's when they'll be able to, I think, really instantly prioritize based on that.
Any more questions? No.
Okay.
Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, everyone.